All right, well, welcome and thank you for joining us for our Fall 2021 Virtual Visiting Scholar webinar series. I'm Virginia Rhodes, Project Director for the ARC Network, and we're so excited to host Dr. Joya Misra from our third cohort of Virtual Visiting Scholars for today's webinar. If you're unfamiliar with the program, the Virtual Visiting Scholars program empowers scholars to complete metasynthesis and meta-analysis of existing literature to address critical issues relevant to equity in STEM. Now, before we introduce today's amazing speaker, I would like to take care of a few housekeeping items. First, I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and we will make those recordings available on our website and social media. Today, we will also be using Zoom's integrated live captioning. So to walk you through some of the functions, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll see a number of different menu options, including live transcript. Clicking on the little caret will reveal options to show or hide the subtitles. You can also view or hide the full transcript. Also hovering over the bottom of your Zoom window reveals options for Q&A and chat located in the center. So for the beginning of our webinar, you'll only be able to view the chat messages from the ARC team. We'll share links to resources and our feedback survey in the chat box. We'll open the chat for attendees at the start of our Q&A portion. But if you do have any questions for the speakers as she's talking, please add them to the Q&A, and you can also upvote questions that resonate with you. Now, ARC Network's Community Engagement Manager, Stephanie Page, will briefly share more about the ARC Network before introducing today's speaker.
Thank you for joining us, everyone. The goal of the ARC Network is to create and cultivate a broad community that bridges the gap between researchers and practitioners. As the STEM Equity Brain Trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions through convenings, a curated resource library, emerging research workshops, a virtual visiting scholars program, and online events like this one. The ARC Network is built on and works through a framework integrating inclusion, intersectionality, and intentionality. We strive to ensure that our work accounts for the social stratifications that intertwine to determine the unique inequities that folk experience. The ARC Network is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advanced Program, and the Women in Engineering Proactive Network, or WEPAN, serves as our home organization. To learn more about the ARC Network, we encourage you to visit equityandstem.org, where you can also join the community if you haven't already. You can also find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at ARC Equity in STEM and hashtag Equity in STEM. We are so absolutely excited for today's discussion for project presentations for cohort 3 of the Virtual Visiting Scholars. And just to remind you, as Virginia said, if you have any questions for our speaker, please add them to our Q&A box and upvote questions that resonate with you. We will also open up the chat once the Q&A portion begins. But to get to the reason why we are here today, joining us is Dr. Joya Misra. Dr. Misra is currently Professor of Sociology of Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She is currently the chair of the Sex and Gender section of the American Sociological Association, one of the 3 largest sections in the discipline. And she is also the director of the Institute for Social Science Research at UMass. She has also served as vice president of the Faculty Union at UMass, as vice president of the American Sociological Association, and as editor of Gender and Society. Dr. Misra's experience includes leadership on multiple NSF advanced grants, which focus on organizational change for gender equity in STEM. Dr. Misra's research explores inequality from an intersectional standpoint, and she published her first piece on intersectional inequality among faculty members in 1999. Her collaborative research on gender equity in STEM appears in a wide array of journals, as well as in regular contributions to Inside Higher Education. A recent article in Gender and Society focuses on gendered and racialized perceptions of faculty workload. And she has a number of recent articles focused on how to address faculty equity during COVID-19, given the disparate effects of the pandemic. Dr. Misra earned her BA in religion from Centenary College and her MA and PhD in sociology from Emory University. Thank you so much for joining us, Joya. And let's just take a moment to switch over screen share. Perfect, thank you.
Wonderful. And so you can see the correct screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'm so grateful to the ARC Network for supporting my work as part of the VBS program, especially Stephanie Page, Crystal Bedley, Bethany Farmer, Ashley Garcia, Meredith Gibson, Heather Metcalf, Elizabeth Sayre, Racialized, Sims, and Virginia Rhodes. Thank you all so much for the support and for letting me do this work. So I was brought to the study by something that I have found puzzling. I've worked my entire career on inequalities in higher education, including how white women and women of color tend to be disadvantaged in academia. But my research also uncovered that women, and especially women of color, also are more engaged in service, spending more time on it, doing more managerial work, especially at the associate professor level. Over the last several years, with my wonderful, wonderful colleagues, Carrie Ann O'Meara, Audrey Jager, Dawn Culpepper, Alexandra Kuveva, and Courtney Leonards, we've made a study of workload inequities and offered approaches to creating more equitable workloads. And yet, research also consistently shows that senior leadership positions remain dominated by white men, particularly at R1 universities. People in higher education often talk about the pipeline problem, that there is not enough supply of women and faculty of color. I don't love the pipeline metaphor itself. I prefer the metaphor of roads with potholes and pathways and exits developed by Anna Bong Anna Branch, who characterizes, that there's like all of these kind of structural things that are keeping us from being successful. Whereas the pipeline problem might kind of focus more on getting individual women into the right place. But even so, I do think that this is kind of an interesting thing. This is an interesting case because there's some indication. We know that women are doing all of these leadership roles, especially at really local levels in universities, because they're doing so much of this service. And yet, so they should be in the pipeline for senior leadership, and yet they're not being chosen for senior leadership. They're not moving into senior leadership in the ways that we might expect. So I really, wanted to know why. This is what I wanted to dig in on, and I was so grateful to ARC Network for funding me to try to think this through. My meta-analysis started with searching a lot of data sources for literature on leadership in higher education that focused on gender and race. So I used terms like leadership or lead with terms like women, gender, race, higher education, faculty, university administrators. And I looked through a lot of different sources. So databases for education, for sociology, for gender scholarship, but I also found a lot of sources through dissertations, which were often based on interviews with a few women leaders. Many of those were for degrees in higher education or management. I examined all the citations of the pieces that I found to add additional sources, and that added many more that I hadn't found before. And I also combed through certain journals, just looking for missing articles that weren't being cited. Overall, I ended up identifying more than 1,000 relevant articles and incorporated about a quarter of those in my review, which is 95 pages long. So this was definitely a big project. It was the longest review I've written in my life. And I have a women of color writing group that meets online every day from 3 to 5 throughout the year. And I just kept chipping away at the review as I was working on it. I know that they're really happy that after today, they won't have to hear me keep talking about it. So there's 5 main sections in the body of my review, and I'm going to focus on 3 of the sections bolded here just to make this a little bit more biteable. So I'm going to talk about the pathways to leadership, the challenges of leadership, and then the gendered workload inequalities and the puzzle of women's higher service loads. So That should leave us with a little time for Q&A. You should feel free to ask me about some of the other sections that I'm not talking about. And you're going to see that I'm going to be peppering in photos of women higher ed leaders, because although my talk is kind of depressing, I want to acknowledge that there are women leaders who have done an exceptional job of making it through the challenges that I enumerate and really succeeding in leadership roles. So the review starts off by kind of touching on the pathways to leadership, including early career barriers that women face. So insofar that white women and women of color are less likely to be hired, tenured, and promoted due to biased processes of recruitment and promotion, particularly in STEM fields, they're not available as leaders. Many of us never make it to tenure line jobs. Many women and women of color in particular serve in contingent positions. Others hit potholes on the way to tenure. Even if we earn tenure, we're less likely to be promoted to full, particularly in STEM. So rather than hitting the glass ceiling, I would say that many of us experience a sticky floor. For the most senior positions in higher education, things like chancellor, president, provost, vice president, dean, attaining promotion to full is critical. And in many STEM disciplines, women and women of color in particular remain underrepresented at those very senior ranks. So this reflects a lot of different issues. It reflects how our research tends to be less valued by our colleagues, especially if we're doing community-based work or translational work aimed at making a difference in our communities. One of the challenges is in how excellence, which is often used as a standard for promotion, can be a vague enough concept so that it operates in ways that kind of move men forward while limiting women's mobility. Women leaders in top academic positions appear to be more likely than men to, when they are successful, to have come through a very traditional scholar leader pathway, maybe also studying higher education and leadership to prepare for their success. Women also tend to move into senior positions after succeeding in other managerial positions. So they're asked to serve an interim or acting positions before they're actually put into these senior level positions, whereas men just kind of move more swiftly up the ladder. They just go right into them. They don't have to go through the acting or interim process. Women presidents are more likely than men presidents to have previously served as an interim president or a chief academic officer or provost. They're also more likely to have gained experience in many different roles. So they've done work in the academic side, in the finance side, in the IT side, and the student affairs side within upper administration, whereas men are more likely to have just followed one route to get up. And women, so all of this is to suggest that, we're basically held to much higher expectations. We're asked to do more to prove that we actually deserve to be senior leaders. Women who can move to another institution may be more likely to be able to move into leadership positions. So there's some notation of the literature that women have to move out to move up, although men are more likely to be promoted from within. Women are also more likely to be brought in during times of crisis. This is referred to in the management literature as the glass cliffs phenomenon. And there is a lot of empirical evidence that both companies and institutions of higher education only take a chance on women leaders when the organization is experiencing a downturn. There is a crisis, and when the crisis sort of comes about, the woman can be blamed and kind of moved aside. Women presidents are also much more likely to express than men presidents that the search process did not realistically and accurately disclose the challenges the institution was facing. So these glass cliff positions are ones that may also come with fewer rewards. They might come in with less authority, and women may be more willing to accept such positions than men because they have fewer opportunities in general for leadership positions. Planning a pathway to leadership, learning skills such as problem solving, running meetings, communicating, seeking leadership opportunities, that can be really important. But women appear to be less likely to have planned moving into administrative roles than men. So women leaders are more likely to note that they didn't necessarily work in strategic ways to attain leadership positions. They note their reluctance to lead. They might suggest that they accidentally ended up in leadership positions, perhaps not fully recognizing the skills that brought them into leadership. In other cases, women, and particularly women of color, may not be given the opportunity to pursue leadership. So women describe themselves as working hard, responding to encouragement, learning from previous leadership experiences, but often not following a linear or strategic path to their eventual posts. Women, in particular, women of color, may be less likely to promote themselves for leadership relative to their colleagues who are men. Yet some women leaders do acknowledge the role of planning and ambition in their success. One key element of planning is taking risks, saying yes to opportunities, and many women administrators recognize that they're people who really enjoy seeking out new challenges and new opportunities. They have a strong motivation to accomplishing new things, making a difference by being involved in work that they think of as meaningful and that enables others to grow. This is something that's particularly important to women of color leaders. So women leaders often aim to serve as change agents, shifting university priorities to create more inclusive institutions. And substantial research does suggest that women leaders do not necessarily begin their careers assuming that they want to lead, but move into leadership, reflecting their hope to make a bigger impact at the college, at the university, bringing in some best practices, enjoying the ability to make positive change. So they try to create opportunities for white women or women of color to support their communities. Another pathway into leadership can come through encouragement from other leaders, though women appear to be less likely to be recruited into leadership positions and are less likely to be given feedback or coached on how to be successful as leaders. Some research suggests that women face discouragement and sabotage when they seek leadership positions, including being told supervisors that they shouldn't be overly ambitious. The mirror or the clone effect suggests that leaders are more likely to encourage and promote those who look like them, which at many universities mean men are more likely to be recruited into leadership. Yet existing leaders may still invite women to move into leadership positions or recommend them for positions or higher education leadership programming. Networking, mentoring, and training programs all appear critical to women's success in achieving academic leadership positions. Many leaders gain access to leadership positions through their networks, though white women and women of color may have less access to such opportunities due to more limited networks. For women of color, forming coalitions and developing supportive communities has been really essential to moving into leadership positions. Engaging with other women leaders can also allow women to share strategies, approaches, develop resilience, new skills, such as how to negotiate. Yet if white men, for example, control more resources and power within an organization, networks that only include women can be less effective at helping women gain leadership roles. So men in higher leadership positions are more likely to report receiving mentoring into leadership. Evidence suggests that women benefit more from mentoring since they're often left out of leadership networks or what might serve as old boys networks. Mentoring can really further help address the dearth of women leaders, but some researchers argue that if we just really focus on mentoring, it's kind of a fix the women approach. So rather than recognizing that the system is set up in ways that are gender biased, we're kind of like asking women to kind of like change to fit into the system. Mentors can, though, provide women with information about professional norms and cultures, and they can encourage, provide feedback, offer opportunities, facilitate career progression. Mentorship programs within a university can be particularly effective in terms of coaching women about their institution's culture, the politics, the leadership expectations. And women of color leaders, of course, benefit from connecting with other women of color, especially those at other institutions that can identify the particular binds that women of color face in higher ed leadership. Networks and mentoring, remain pretty important because there's surprisingly little formal training for many university leaders. But it is women presidents who are more likely than men to report that they've taken part in training programs before becoming president. And that's true for many senior leadership positions. Several formal programs are aimed at supporting emerging women leaders, and they've played a really important role in this, of course. But the concern is that these programs can also operate as remedial programs. So they reinforce the idea that women are less capable of leading. And then another concern is that they need more follow through after the program to ensure women's long-term success, because though there are many programs available, the numbers of women leaders haven't really dramatically changed. Conceptually, it's important to recognize that the organization of higher education reflects, so this is my leadership challenges section, gendered and racialized assumptions, including both structural policies and practices and cultural norms. Institutional practices often reflect and reinforce gendered hierarchies, while norms and customs can hide gendered practices and processes. So for example, if a university promotes mentoring, but then types mentoring as feminine and devalue it, rather than addressing gender inequalities, mentoring actually can reinforce these inequalities. So the structure of opportunity within gendered organizations further tends to lead women to be less likely to aspire to move up into leadership positions or to succeed when they try. Women often have fewer role models than men, fewer examples of leaders who share similar traits with them. And many women leaders face discrimination throughout their careers. They're perceived as outsiders. They're given limited information about the rules of the game. And this is doubly true for women of color who are often isolated from other leaders. Especially when there are very few white women or women of color in senior leadership positions, these women can be highly scrutinized and treated as tokens or as invisible. Colleagues may belittle, ignore, exclude, or assume that women leaders are incompetent. Universities often have an organizational culture that suggests that the ideal worker is a person who can work long hours and prioritize work with no other responsibilities outside of the workplace, such as care. And this idea is exacerbated for leaders. So this principle was developed when most faculty members were upper-class white men with few care responsibilities. Even as the faculty has become more diverse, the ideal has remained. These ideal worker norms further tend to assume that it's great men or it's heroes who are better leaders. And these factors also tend to rule out leaders who have health issues or disabilities. Assumptions about women as leaders also often reflect gendered and racialized stereotypes of their groups. Gender stereotypes lead men to have more influence in teams and receive more credit for their ideas, as work by the really brilliant Cecilia Ridgway and Shelley Carell shows. Stereotypes are more likely to be activated when people don't have very clear evaluation criteria. Since information about performance and evaluation are often less clear for university leaders than even for faculty members, stereotypes can be particularly pernicious for women leaders. Stereotypes may be used as a justification for discriminating against women leaders, including by search firms who more frequently run searches for university leaders, as well as by the senior leaders who serve as hiring authorities. Stereotypes might include the notion that women are not good leaders because they're weak, they're less assertive, they're less persuasive, they're less intellectual, they're bad decision makers, they're incompetent, while emphasizing instead, well, the positive, the positive stereotype is that women can be supportive leaders. But this also really creates a double bind for women leaders. Because if, for example, women are perceived as assertive, they might lose support because they're not acting in ways that are perceived as feminine. So even as men get rewarded for being tough, and men might even be rewarded for being caring, women are, punished for being both caring and tough. While men are valued for acting in, these different ways, women are critiqued. And, even things like women who engage in self-promotion might be viewed as problematic because that's not gender normative. While white women might face stereotypes about their lack of leadership skills, there's just a lot of evidence. And one of the nice things about having read all of these dissertations is many of them were sort of focused on particular subgroups. So just Latinx women or just Indigenous women. And so it gave me a chance to really think through, okay, well, what are the different kinds of stereotypes that different groups face? So for example, Latinas might be stereotyped as long-suffering caregivers. Asian or Middle Eastern women may be stereotyped as passive and therefore not good leaders. Black women might be stereotyped as too outspoken, right? So there's all of these kinds of stereotypes that are both racialized and gender, and these intersecting inequalities come together to shape our women leaders' experiences. Many studies also point to the challenges that women face in leadership positions in terms of microaggressions, hostility, bullying, and/or harassment. One common microaggression that we all probably know is men repackaging women leaders' ideas as their own. Some work argues that discrimination worsens as women move up into higher administration posts, suggesting that the masculine culture of organizations are maintained even as women become leaders. Women of color often face harassment and microaggressions, as well as racist and sexist discrimination. And in addition to sexual harassment, there's a lot of gender harassment that occurs. So people are just devalued and disrespected as a result of their gender. When facing discrimination, women leaders have to also know how to respond and resist, navigating the stereotypes and double binds as they do so. So you can't appear to be driven by emotion, even if you are facing pretty dramatic discrimination. These challenges are often exacerbated for women of color, leading to feelings of isolation, stress, and invisibility, as well as this feeling that, we have to be constantly hypervigilant in the face of stereotyping and microaggressions from coworkers. An outgrowth of racialized and gendered stereotypes, harassment, and microaggressions is imposter syndrome, as women internalize that discrimination that they face, believing that they don't belong or imposters don't deserve their positions. And it's really important to me that we always kind of like connect these things. Imposter syndrome doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of the sense in which you're constantly facing discrimination and being told you're not good enough. So this may make women academics less likely to pursue leadership opportunities. And because women leaders may experience particularly challenging discrimination, this may induce doubt in themselves later in their careers. In one study where higher education leaders and their coworkers rated their effectiveness on several different dimensions of leadership, although men and women's effectiveness as judged by their coworkers was not statistically different, so they were kind of rated the same, women rate themselves significantly lower than their coworkers rate them. Men rate themselves significantly higher. So women have much less confidence in their leadership abilities than men, and men are overconfident, even though their leadership appears to be equally effective. Imposter syndrome is then again, not just gendered, but racialized. Women are more likely to see themselves, women of color are more likely to see themselves as imposters. This is really magnified. And some women describe developing confidence because of the challenges that they face. So if they can kind of use it as a way to develop self-efficacy, but men are more likely to develop that sense of confidence. And then finally, care responsibilities also matter. Women who ascend to higher ranks and leadership positions are much more likely than men to be unmarried, to be divorced, or to be childless. Women of color leaders are even less likely than white women to be partnered or to have children. Leadership positions in many universities require long hours, work on weekends, substantial travel, and as leaders move up ranks, as well as frequent relocation. So women's care responsibilities shape their opportunities. Some wait till their children are older before taking on leadership positions. Most higher education leaders really have taken non-linear paths to leadership when they are women. While teaching students or conducting research, so this is now moving into the gendered workload inequalities section. So many university faculty teach students or conduct research, and those are considered as kind of central to faculty jobs. But we also spend substantial time carrying out service work that's less likely to be valued or rewarded in the same way, though it's really critical to the university's effectiveness and its continued kind of moving forward. This mismatch between the work that is necessary for colleges and universities to succeed and the work that is rewarded in faculty evaluations lead to workload inequities, with some faculty focusing on rewarded work and others taking up the necessary but unrewarded work. These workload inequities reflect gendered and racialized biases. So men tend to allocate more time to research, while women spend more time mentoring and advising students and carrying out service. Some service can be coded as masculine and valorized, so chairing a review committee, editing a journal, while others is coded as feminine and devalued, mentoring faculty, writing letters of recommendation, which is rarely noted in reviews or included in faculty CVs and may appear to be secret service. On the other hand, the more valorized work may be more likely to lead to leadership opportunities. Some research points out that women are responding to gendered expectations for service work, fearing penalties or actively experiencing penalties if they don't agree to carry it out. So women feel pressured to work more, to do a good job on service, even though this work can undercut their career advancement. And this again speaks to the bind felt by many women faculty members. So we're hemmed in by gender stereotypes that expect us to be agreeable, which leads us to spend less time on the valued activities, which leads to limiting our career mobility. And then, of course, women get punished if they protect their time in the way that men do. So many women face a no-win situation. At the same time, faculty of color, particularly Black, Latinx, and Indigenous faculty, often also engage in more time spent mentoring students, doing community engaged work, carrying out service, which can reduce their time spent on research that's the most valued by some institutions. Faculty of color may face expectations they will do more diversity work for the institution, what's been referred to as an identity tax. Students of color often rely on mentoring and support from faculty of color who may also really value giving back. So faculty women of color are facing this increased expectations based on both their race and their gender to carry out substantial mentoring, service that's informal and is unrecognized by colleges and universities. And, in many cases, universities are really anxious to showcase and how diverse their faculty are, even when the university is not actually that diverse. So women of color serve on many more committees than their white colleagues. They're expected to do more diversity work for the campus, even as this work is undervalued or under-recognized by reward systems. So even if this work is really meaningful to faculty members, and I think it really is for many of us, it can still have a negative material effects on the retention and the promotion of women of color as long as it remains undervalued by colleges and universities. And it can be very challenging insofar that it reinforces that those doing the work don't have the same sense of belonging as the other faculty members, right? We have to keep making that point again and again. So gendered and racialized ideologies are reflected in our actual workload differences in ways that appear to punish or limit the career opportunities for women of color. So going back to how I started this talk, my goal was to sort out why we see this mismatch. Women are doing so much service, but they're not advancing into leadership roles. And my review gives me some insight into how this puzzle is really not a contradiction, but actually two sides of the same coin. It's in doing the less valued work that is not being done by many men colleagues that women's career opportunities are limited. Leaders are drawn from those doing the valorized work. And at every stage, white women and women of color face disadvantages with regards to career mobility. This appeared to be true in the literature I reviewed about pathways to leadership, where there were documented differences between men's and women's paths. It's evident in the challenge on the section on the challenges white women and women of color face. White men, from reading all of these pieces, it sort of looked to me like white men are kind of strolling along. White women are running some sort of obstacle course, and women of color are running an obstacle course on ice, if any of you ever played any of those We Fit games. But importantly, my findings suggest that unrecognized service operates as a weight. So white men are usually not carrying that on their stroll. White women and women of color are carrying that weight as they run the obstacle course. So the solution, it can't be that we just stop doing service and mentoring, because it really is the work that makes the university go round. And in many cases, it does give meaning to us and to our work. Instead, what I would argue for is that we need systems in place that ensure that this workload is equitably distributed and not concentrated on white women and women of color. And here you could Google faculty workload and rewards, and Carrie Ann O'Meara's beautiful website comes up with almost all of our sites. Not quite all of them are available there for the work that we've done. And that work was an action project that was also an experiment. So we really could test and see which interventions worked and which ones didn't. So we really have evidence that there are ways to distribute workload more equitably. I also think that it's really critical to make sure that all of this work is rewarded and recognized in systems of evaluation and seen as evidence of good leadership, right? So I think that rather than having these kinds of evaluation systems that focus only on research, we really need to have evaluation systems that recognize service work and mentoring and diversity work as very valuable to the university. And one of the ways that we can kind of identify who a good leader would be. And then finally, I think, of course, we have to also keep working to undo the many other forms of discrimination that create a sticky floor for women in STEM. So, we can work on the workload inequalities for sure. We can try to make sure that women are rewarded appropriately for their work, but we also have to make sure that we can get through, that we can actually get into the space where we can become leaders. So that is the end of my talk, and I am hoping that we have some time for Q&A and lots of conversation, and I'm just so excited that you all came today and are here to talk.
Thank you so much, Joya, for such a great talk. I really enjoyed all your metaphors of the sticky floors and the road full of potholes. It's so interesting. So we'll now open the chat and start our Q&A. And let's see, it looks like we have a question already from an anonymous attendee who writes, several women in leadership positions on our campus, dean to provost level, have been subjected to anonymous faculty evaluations that have included inappropriate gendered responses. Have you seen any studies on the gendered evaluations that women in leadership are subject to? And if yes, does this lead them to leave leadership positions? They include that they know there's a large literature on gendered student evaluations of women and underrepresented minority faculty, but have not seen anything about faculty evaluation of higher ed leaders.
You know, this is such an amazing question. And I've got to tell you, I read like 1,000 pieces. And I did not see anything that really focused on evaluation in that sense and the ways in which evaluation is gendered and racialized. So that's certainly something that that needs to be done. I'm really in the process right now of really trying to think through an empirical project that I can build on. I'm hoping to write a proposal this year. I'm writing a proposal this year based on this to do some empirical work on this. But this is such a good question that it actually kind of sends me in a different direction, because I do think I have really strong ideas about how evaluation of leaders needs to be occurring. But I believe that part of the story for the way evaluation of leaders needs to happen is that we need to have a lot more evidence when we're evaluating leaders. But you're absolutely right that that process will still be biased, that we will still see racialized and gendered biases kind of baked into that. And so we have to find ways to get around it. One of the things that I found really interesting in the social psych literature on the evaluation of leaders, not in higher ed, so kind of more in the management kind of world, was that in that literature, generally, there were not gender differences in how effective leaders were seen by the people beneath them, even though there were kind of gender differences in how the leaders themselves saw themselves as effective. So I mentioned that. But you know, like even that literature didn't allow me to look at, that doesn't really talk about how the people above. So I think this is a great idea. I think it's like something that I hope many other people in the audience might think about doing some research on, because it's clearly needed.
Thanks. And they add that they should have said chair to provost. They believe that women leave leadership positions because of this.
Absolutely.
Let's see here. So lots of questions in the chat for you. So our next from another anonymous attendee compliments you on a fascinating talk and ask, have you looked into factors at the pre-faculty phase, so postdocs, for example, and if not, can you recommend any scholars who have explored this area?
I think there are a lot of really great, there's just an enormous amount of wonderful scholarship in this area. I myself know a lot more about the things that are limiting to doctoral students and limiting to assistant professors than postdocs is that particular phase, though I've read a few pieces. I have this beautiful Mendeley library that has many, many sources in it. So probably what I would like to do is kind of go through it and provide a few ideas. So maybe I can do that in some way. But yeah, I do think there's a lot of literature on this that really sort of works through this set of problems. And I will say, you know, like my project that is looking at UMass Amherst, the project that we're doing there, I include interviews done with women of color, and then I match them by rank and department to men of color, white women, and white men. And one of the like fascinating things that came out in those interviews, which were just of faculty, was how different their pathways were all the way through. And I interviewed the white men last. So when I got to them, I was kind of shocked because their stories were so different. But that includes how easy it was for them to go to graduate school, how easy it was for them to find great postdoc sponsors, how easy it was for them to have postdoc sponsors that treated them with a lot of respect and gave them a lot of autonomy, as well as how easy it was for them to get assistant professor positions. So it was very different for women of color, and certainly different for the white women as well.
Great. So I'm going to ask another question from the Q&A, and then I see that some questions in the chat as well, so I'll get to those. But from Beth Mitchnick, who thanks you for a great talk and asks, what can the average faculty member, male or female of color or not, do to make change happen around women and leadership? She's thinking about the everyday practices.
Yeah, the everyday practices are absolutely the ones we have to attack. I mean, I do really think like the very first thing we can do is we can really focus on workload equity in our departments. So we can just make sure that the service responsibilities, the things that need to be done, the mentoring, all of this is actually equitably distributed. And by that, I don't mean that everybody needs to do exactly the same amount of work, in the same areas. It's more of it, if people specialize in certain areas, so if there's somebody who is a really good mentor, maybe they do a little less service in another area, right? Like that we create equitable systems. So that's like probably my number one thing. The number two thing I think we can do is we can change the way we evaluate faculty members. And we can recognize that all of these parts of our workload should be part of how we're evaluated. Like when I came into my department, we had this funny evaluation system where everybody was scored, and we were scored in research, teaching, and service. And then we weighted research by 3, teaching by 2, service by 1. One of the things we did was we just changed them to be equally. Research, teaching, and service are equally weighted. And I remember having colleagues say, oh no, that's terrible. It's going to mean that people don't spend time on their research anymore. No, it won't happen like that. Actually, what it does is it kind of like creates a system in which people who don't pull their weight don't get as much merit, and people who do. And actually everybody was much happier with that change. So I do think that there are everyday things we can do in our departments, but I also think that there are really important shifts that university leaders need to be taking on.
Great, thank you. Now a question from the chat, excuse me if I mispronounce your name, Jorge Rebaza. On your action steps slide, second bullet, they ask, do you know of some universities that have revised their RPT policies to include DEI and mentoring work? And if not, do you have some specific suggestions?
Yes, there are a number of universities that have been revising them and have been getting a lot of exciting kind of attention. I know Purdue is one of them. My own university, UMass, is one of them. I know that Carrie Ann O'Meara, my wonderful collaborator, is working on a paper that kind of covers a lot of these things. So I encourage you to look for that. I believe it's coming out at ACE. But so yes, universities are making these revisions, and Carrie Ann actually also has a big NSF grant to look at how DEI work is valued. So that's another thing to be looking out for. But so I think it's happening. I think that, for example, at my university, we have like an alternative path to promotion so that you can be promoted to full because of your enormous contributions in other areas. And I think that this can be a really wonderful way of recognizing and valuing all of the different kinds of scholarship, teaching, mentoring, and service that we do. I think we also have to be kind of careful because we can have unintended consequences when we create different tracks, because it could then kind of lead to a reinforcing thing that some faculty go through this track and other faculty go through that track. And if it's racialized and gendered, it will just kind of reinforce the problem. So what I want to see is policies that apply to everybody.
Great. Eleanor Winsong brings up a good question in the chat. So if one pathway to leadership is taking on specific service or forms of lower level leadership, how can this be balanced for women who have younger children? So overall, how much is the literature really addressing the effects of motherhood as a specific gendered barrier?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's some of the work that I've done earlier in my career, especially with my wonderful colleague Jennifer Lundquist and Abby Templer, and also I think a little bit with Carrie Ann, where we really tried to look at caregiving responsibilities and tried to understand, like, how is this playing out in faculty careers? One of the important things that we found in our work there was that it's a really sad story, but it really reflects the way that gender operates, right? So, for example, when men and women have young children, both men and women tend to reduce how much time they spend on work. Not a lot. It's really a pretty small reduction, but they do reduce a little bit how much time they spend on work. What's really interesting there is that men continue to protect their research time, so that research time does not reduce. And women reduce their research time. So men reduce the time that they spent on mentoring and service before they had kids, and women reduce the time that they spend on research. So basically, we take it out of our own hides, right? We say, we don't want to affect you. We don't want to affect our students. We don't want to affect the department, and so that kind of is a really painful reminder that gender kind of keeps reasserting this. And Carrie Ann O'Meara's work has shown really effectively that women also get many more requests, and they're not just from our supervisors, but they're from our peers and they're from our students. So men are much less likely to be getting the requests, making it easier for men to kind of hold the line and say, no, I'm going to save this research time, whereas women are kind of inundated and therefore they give it up. So that is actually also, it really is important to recognize that that's something that intersects with care in really important ways. So what is the solution to that? I guess, like, one of the solutions I've always had to that is really that that women should feel really comfortable protecting their research time and kind of referencing the literature and saying, hey, we know that this is a problem, so I'm going to protect my research time. But I do think that it's also possible for people to be engaged in service work that is really meaningful to them when they have young children, as long as that work is then compensated with something else. So, for example, maybe chairing a committee is really an important thing to do. And it's like, again, like sort of a more valued form of leadership. But maybe if they agree to chair that committee, they get a teaching release, or they get some other kind of, they get a little research support. They get something that makes up the difference, so that they're not always kind of working from a deficit in order to do this work.
Great. And kind of similar question along the lines of, taking on that extra work from Melody Cardin-Jessen. So how do you maintain diverse representation on committees and work groups without overworking those few women and women of color on the faculty? So making sure that you have that diverse representation, but not overworking those few people you have.
Yeah, I think this is such an important issue. And, I just think it's this kind of funny thing where we, like, for a long time, the committees weren't diverse. And then we were like, oh no, really, the committees have to be diverse. If we want to become more diverse and inclusive places, we've got to create these more diverse committees. But it was like we kind of swung from one end to the other without really thinking about what that would mean is that women of color, but also white women in STEM would be kind of inundated with way more service than other folks because of the need for that diversity requirement. But I don't love the idea that we get rid of it entirely, like that we just say, well, fine, we're just not going to have diverse committees. I mean, I do think that there are kind of two big strategies here. One of them is like Stride Training is developed at Michigan Advance, working to train everybody who serves on, for example, hiring committees to address bias, so that it doesn't have to be just those of us who are demographically diverse in some way who are recognizing the importance of diversity and inclusion. But I also really believe that it does help for us to be in the room. And I think we need to be compensated. So if we are asked to serve on more committees, then we are giving a teaching release. Or if there is a need for my representation this year, then I am given a service sabbatical the following year, right? So that we create equity. We try to make sure that everybody has an equal amount of work, not the same work. But if somebody is being asked to do more of a certain kind, we take away something, right?
Yeah, completely agree there. So along the lines of this invisible service as weight, pothole and workload equity. An anonymous attendee is hoping you can speak to differences you may have found in the literature between R1 and R2 type institutions and large comprehensive versus master's type institutions.
Yeah, this is again like something that I'm really hoping to follow up in my empirical work, because one of the problems with this literature is that so much of it is occurring from so much of it is happening through students writing dissertations, and they are at R1 universities. And so they are interviewing people at R1 universities. There's definitely, we know a lot. We do know a lot about how, like at community colleges, they have the most diverse leadership by both race and gender. And that, it's kind of like this mirrored effect, like at different types of universities, we see more or less diversity. There's also something very interesting that I'm not going to follow up on at private universities and the ways in which diversity can be used in those spaces. So sometimes there's even more kind of attention placed, but it's a little bit more window dressy. But in any case, empirically, one of the things I really want to do is follow up with a study that really looks at how at public universities at every level, race and gender operate for leaders, because I do think there's a real need for this. I think we really want to understand exactly what is happening at different kinds of institutions. There's a sense that there can be some more openings at places that are not R1s, but there's not enough evidence in the existing literature to make me really sure about that.
Great. And again, another anonymous attendee asks, so how would you recommend better enlisting information about those Secret Service activities in the faculty evaluation forms? How can we measure these activities better?
I have been thinking a lot about this, and I'm actually giving a talk tomorrow in which I'm trying to help departments think through this. So I've been thinking a lot about it. And I think part of it is that we just have to make the invisible visible. So for example, we can ask people, for how many different students did you write letters of recommendation this year? I do think it's like not a perfect thing, to ask how many letters of recommendation did you write, because it could be, it could be that one student applied to 50 things. But I do think it can really help to have some indication of, how much informal mentoring did you engage in? So how many students that you're not on their committees do you meet with regularly? Who do you mentor, or how many people do you mentor among your faculty peers? So take these things that we know of as kind of the invisible or the Secret Service and actually make them into things that are part of our evaluation forms. And not to say everybody needs to be doing everything, right? But instead, we're going to credit the things that everybody is doing.
Great. It looks like we've got time for one more question. So in response to one of your recommendations, Sonia Goltz in the chat notes some efforts on her own campus. So there have some grassroots efforts. They've made some grassroots efforts, to have DEI work recognized. So the Senate proposed language for the faculty handbook, though they ran into substantial barriers from both a few very vocal, mostly male white faculty saying that's already part of service, which is already recognized and rewarded, and also some other obstacles from their administration who said a vote across campus needed to be taken. Have you heard any other similar stories at universities?
I think that's true. I mean, I think that it is, I think that there are many folks who are anxious at the idea that DEI is going to be valued, right? And I think we saw very similar things when universities and colleges started using diversity statements for hiring, right? People just said, we don't need this. This isn't useful. And, it was really only when many of them had adopted them that some others kind of came along. I think that we're kind of in the same place. This is part of why I'm so excited about Carrie Ann Amira's work on this, because I think that it's an opportunity for us to really open up the hood and try to understand how DEI work is being evaluated at different universities and recognized. And hopefully we'll be able to provide enough evidence to convince some of these folks who are foot dragging and not wanting to see the work, emphasized.
Great. Thank you so much, Joya, for such a great presentation and a wonderful Q&A session from all of our attendees. I'll turn it back over to Stephanie, who will close us out.
Yes, thank you so very much. I think we were sending each other like high fives and church fans and everything in between throughout your talk, Joya. This was so wonderful, and thank you again to our audience for such engaging questions. Joya's report is available on our website, and we are adding the link to that in the chat. You can also find more of Joya's work and resources that she has curated in the ARC Network library on Mendeley. And again, we are so thankful to you, Joya, for joining us and for presenting your work and being a part of our Virtual Visiting Scholars program. And we're also always thankful to have our community join us for these important discussions. I am encouraging, I hope you will continue to join us for the last two of our cohort 3 presentations, which will be next month on December 2nd and December 16th, where we will have Ramon Barthelemy and Kimberly Scott from cohort 3. The registration links for those webinars are also being added to the chat. I'd also love for you to join us for WePan's Women of Color Summit. And it's so incredible that we had Joya's talk today. It's almost a lead into the summit next week, where we will be featuring a number of speakers, including some of our virtual visiting scholars, on topics ranging from securing institutional support for women of color in STEM to applying intersectionality as a framework to advance women of color in STEM fields. And again, the link for information and the registration page for the summit is also being added to the chat. And lastly, but never least, please provide feedback on your experience with today's webinar by completing our survey that we are also dropping into the chat. So just one more thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Joya for being a part of this program. Your work is so profoundly impactful. And to our attendees,